Deputy President. I rise tonight to speak on the Recycling Waste Reduction Bill, and in doing so, as senators often do, we reflect on the constituents in our communities, people all across Queensland who would be listening in on this debate and taking special attention. Now, because I live in Cairns, I live in the same place as Molly Steer, who's a 12-year-old campaigner who led the Straw No More campaign and managed to eradicate straws from Cairns at the very young age of, I think she was about 10, 11 years old when she started her campaign. So I give this speech tonight in full recognition that there are people like Molly listening and wondering what the government has done after all their rhetoric about action on recycling, action on waste, action on plastics. Because Labor does support this bill, but remains critical of the government's inaction when it comes to regulatory reform of waste management and, quite frankly, the job creation in recycling, which we know is potentially there if the government got the settings right. Evidence from the Senate inquiry showed that while stakeholders support an export waste ban, this bill lacks effectiveness. It highlights the Morrison government's poor track record on making lots of announcements, failing to deliver on those promises. The bill would introduce a ban on export of certain waste materials through a new licensing and declaration scheme with standard qualifying requirements, fees and charges to cover those costs and reporting arrangements. It'll replace and update existing product stewardship laws, making overdue changes to the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme. This legislation has been introduced in part because of China's decision to, in 2018, to ban the importation of most categories of waste, a decision which had a major consequence on the Australian waste management sector. It means that Australia needs to dramatically increase our recycling capability and better manage waste across the board. Labor has been critical of the government for its inaction when it comes to regulatory reform for waste management. Since the Liberal National Government came to power, they have taken no action in listing any new items for co-regulatory or mandatory schemes. The Morrison government has taken 3 years to conduct a review at a time when the country's waste crisis is worsening. Labor will support these bills because there is no time to delay when it comes to banning on the export of waste materials. But in doing so, we want to highlight to the Senate some of the evidence that was received during the Senate inquiry and the report handed down last month, because stakeholders have said that they do support this legislation, but are concerned about the effectiveness of the legislation itself and some of the failures of this government to get the policy settings right. Stakeholders, including the national waste and recycling industry, have acknowledged the government's lack of focus on reforming Australia's product stewardship regime. In their submission, the national waste and recycling industry said, "There is nothing that compels the minister to act should the recommended actions not be completed, nor is it clear if the minister can actually recommend in the priority list apply for accreditation as a voluntary arrangement as an action." The Global Product Stewardship Council submission said, "We encourage the government to consider reflecting more of a clear willingness to pursue co-regulatory approaches as appropriate to build upon the proposed strengthening around the minister's priority list." Stakeholders also recognised problems with the National Environment Protection Measure 2011, which regulates industry participation for improving environmental outcomes for plastic packaging. The Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation drove this point in their submission. They said, "I think the fact that we're 20 years into the regulation and there hasn't been a review is probably more indicative of some of the issues or some of the perceptions that are currently out there. If a national environmental protection measure review had been done, earlier, then obviously it would have informed this discussion and given rise to thinking around other alternatives as well. Labor agrees that this evidence should be heeded and notes that the Morrison government should have reviewed the National Environment Protection Measure in conjunction with the Product Stewardship Act. It was the former Labor government, Senator McAllister pointed out, that established the Product Stewardship Framework in 2011, which included the National Television and Recycling Scheme. This has led to the recycling of 360,000 tonnes of computer, TV, e-waste. But since the Liberal National Government was elected, they have failed to introduce any additional co-regulatory or mandatory schemes. Witnesses during the inquiry recognise that the government's shortcomings in meeting the key targets, including the goal of achieving 70% recycling of packaging and elimination of an unnecessary packaging. Currently, only 12% of plastic packaging in Australia is recycled, despite it being a major contributor to Australia's waste crisis. This raises the question of whether the targets can be achieved within the current voluntary participation framework. It is a shame that it took a ban on importations from another country and several other key nations for the government to act on waste and recycling. There is now a serious deficiency in Australia's recycling capacity. There is now less capacity to recycle plastic than there was in 2005. All of those jobs that could have been created through this industry, if the government was willing to act, have gone wanting. In Australia, we recycle only 12% of plastics, 58% of waste in total. The government's own review found that growing numbers of industry free riders is the primary factor that leads to a failed voluntary scheme. Yet their limited response is to set up a form of naming and shaming to influence businesses to take responsibility, but without any way of affecting that change. What this bill also brings into sharp focus is some of the empty words and lack of follow-up by the Prime Minister and the Morrison government. They are always there for the photo op, and when it comes to recycling, those photo ops are always quite flamboyant, always very interesting. The media releases go out. But even when it comes to recycling and waste, as other senators alluded to, something that the Prime Minister has said that he will champion personally, well, he still has not delivered on this. Just 1 week after the election, the member for Leichhardt, Warren Entsch, hit the headlines in Cairns about his so-called war on plastic pollution. It was the major media story after the election. Mr Entsch had been returned as the member for Leichhardt, and he appeared on the front page, holding up a big bag of waste and saying that he was going to declare a war on waste to protect the Great Barrier Reef. The Morrison government, in making those announcements, promised $100 million for the Australian Recycling Investment Fund to be run by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. $100 million that this government promised. This scheme was intended to provide concessional loans from between $10,000 and $5 million to support the manufacturing of products from recycled plastics and paper to take on the war on waste. But over 12 months later, not a single cent of this fund has been spent. $100 million promise, but now nothing has been spent, starting to become a very familiar pattern for this government. This was confirmed by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which confirmed that $0 had been loaned to date. The Morrison government has form when it comes to making carefully packaged announcements on waste and recycling, but in large part, they're not worth the paper that they are written on. They also promised $20 million for the National Product Stewardship Investment Fund. This announcement was supposed to provide grants between $300,000 and $1 million to encourage new and existing product stewardship schemes for batteries, electronic products and plastic oil containers. But in June this year, the Department of Environment revealed that guidelines for this program had not even been finished. $20 million announcement, and yet we don't even have guidelines yet. The money isn't being spent. All these things that have been promised, well, here we go again. These two schemes form part of what the Morrison government's $167 million recycling investment package. And I'm sure that senators opposite will be getting up in their speeches today talking about these numbers and all these schemes and all these programs. Well, can I tell you, they don't mean anything if you don't actually deliver them. It means that at least 72% of the package that was announced by the Morrison government has made no difference to Australia's waste crisis 18 months on. 18 months on, after the waste crisis was finally acknowledged by this government and a war on waste was declared by members like Mr Ench in Leichhardt, by the Prime Minister Scott Morrison himself, only 72% of the package has not been delivered. Failures like this undermine the federal government's promise that the $600 million Recycling Modernisation Fund would create 10,000 jobs and divert 10 million tonnes of waste from landfill. Again, big numbers, big promises, but it's just not happening. These aren't isolated examples of incompetence. There is example after example of promises not being delivered by this government. The Morrison government announced a $4 billion emergency response fund to prepare for disaster recovery 8 months ago, and we know that that has not been rolled out. There are countless other examples of announcements made by this government, and recycling and waste is another area where they have failed to deliver. Labor supports this bill because there is no time to delay when it comes to banning waste materials and developing our recycling and waste industry. We want to see those jobs. We want to see those jobs in places like regional Queensland. But we remain critical of the Morrison government's record on waste management. This bill will not be as effective as it could be if the Morrison government continues to lag behind on targets to cut plastic pollution. Under the Liberal National Government, only 12% of plastic packaging is being recycled. Progress on election promises like the $100 million Australian Recycling Investment Fund and the $20 million National Product Stewardship Investment Fund have stalled. They have promised to spend this money and they have failed. Time and time again, the Morrison government is failing to roll out what it is promising in a timely manner and in a manner that would make a difference. In many cases, it can't even get program guidelines finalised. So in concluding, can I say to the young people living in Cairns, particularly Molly Steer, the activist of the Straw No More campaign, and all of those people who have stood next to members like Mr Ench, who've gone to the plastic summits and stood next to Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, as he's delivering yet another announcement and a commitment to take on this war on waste, that unfortunately, can I say to those young people, this government is not delivering on its promises. Is not delivering on its promises. They were very happy to stand up next to you, very happy to get a photo with you, very happy to tell you the big numbers that they were going to spend and going to deliver, but they're not doing that. They've stood next to young people and told them that they were going to take action on recycling and waste. They've stood next to workers and said that they were going to create jobs in this industry, but they haven't. The numbers don't lie. They are not spending this money. They are not rolling out these packages, and it can only be for one reason, is that they really are not committed to taking action on recycling, taking action to help our environment or taking action to create jobs. Thank you.